Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. We are working our way through material in Chapter 9, Leadership and Decision Making. And now, in this 8th video, we begin to look at the topic of decision making. This is the first of 3 videos on decision making, part 1. And in order to start this discussion on decision making, I thought that I might first start with a very, very famous poem about decision making that most of us probably encountered in high school. The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that passing there, had grown them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. What a romantic and somewhat simplistic way of looking at the decisions of life, and you can sort of see that illustrated then here. If you think about corporate decision making, here standing at the crossroads, and I chose the path less oft taken, and that has made all the difference. Quite a romantic way of looking at decision making, and perhaps decision making in leadership. However, to pull back the curtain on the reality of decision making in business, it isn't this nice wooded romantic picture, it's more something like this. Holy smokes, confusing, dizzying, unclear. Where are we going? What will be the consequences? I didn't foresee that. Holy smokes, watch out for that car. This is really what the nature of real-time decision-making in business as a leader is really about. And that is why when we begin talking about decision-making, we have some material to chat about. So, the textbook would define decision-making as choosing one alternative from among several options. That is certainly a good generic definition of decision-making, and therefore, especially for leaders, the decision-making process sort of runs along, at least ideally, what you would recognize in the second bullet point. Recognizing and defining the nature of the decision situation, identifying all of your alternatives, choosing the best alternative for the sake of all involved, especially accomplishing organizational goals, and then putting it into practice. That is ideally what you would like to see in decision making. Of course, real decision making involves all sorts of different external factors and pressures and stress and uncertainty and risk, and we'll talk about some of those things in the slides right here in this particular lecture. Now, the textbook begins by discussing there are 2 general types of decisions that leaders typically have to make on an ongoing basis. The first being the programmed decision, which you see there defined by the text as a decision that is relatively structured or recurs with some frequency, or both. Examples of that might be things like funding payroll that gets paid out to your employees on a monthly basis. That is a relatively structured decision that recurs every single month as long as you've got employees, and therefore the type of decision you're going to make is relatively straightforward, and in that particular example, to say the least. However, there is a second type of decision you see there in the green, the non-programmed decision, which the text defines as a decision that is relatively unstructured and it occurs with relatively low frequency. And that may be in business a decision like, an opportunity has come up to acquire a competitor in a merger and acquisition. Should we actually go through with that or not? It doesn't happen every day. Of course, in that particular example, the consequences of making the right or wrong decision could be economically pretty significant. However, at the very bare definition, it's a decision that is relatively unstructured and occurs with very low frequency. So, those are two different types of decisions. And of course, when we talk about the process of decision making, it may really be a question first and foremost, well, is this a programmed decision or is this a non-programmed decision? And therefore, how should we approach it? Your approach to these two different types of decisions may be significantly different from each other. Some of the initial conditions we have to consider then, you see on this slide, one question becomes, well, are we dealing with a pretty tight state of certainty, which the textbook will define as when the decision maker knows with reasonable certainty what the alternatives are and what conditions are associated with each alternative. In business, that could be, again, when you look at the decision whether or not this month to fund payroll from ongoing revenue or whether you're going to do it from cash reserves. You know what the alternatives are, you know with reasonable certainty what the conditions are, and therefore that's a decision that would be made with a reasonable state of certainty. We contrast that with more decisions which quite frankly are more real world. Far more decisions in business deal with some degree of a state of risk, which the textbook defines as when the availability of each alternative and its potential payoffs and costs are all associated with some degree of a probability estimate. In other words, it isn't quite so sure. In other words, there is some degree of a probability factor. What's the probability of this happening or not? Now again, in business, we have reached a degree of comfort with this state of risk, knowing that without risk, we really don't earn any reasonable return. And so all we're really trying to do is do our level best to come up with reasonable and accurate probability estimates and therefore be able to assign the commensurate level of return we demand with a particular commensurate level of risk. That's generally how we approach these kinds of things, and I think you can understand on this slide why, given those two options, we probably see, practically speaking, far more business decisions that have integrated a state of risk rather than those that would fall on the side of a state of pretty sure certainty. Now, all that being said, the very last slide in this deck introduces really what most major decisions in contemporary organizations are really constrained by, and that is not simply a state of risk, but a state of true uncertainty, which the textbook defines when the decision maker does not know all the alternatives, or the risks associated with each, or the likely consequences of each alternative. And this is the reality of life in our contemporary world. And I think we know this. We know that for so many things that we encounter, and that as leaders, we are forced by time constraints to make a decision, we really don't know what all the alternatives are. And we certainly don't know the risks involved with all the alternatives. And we're not really sure in this complex, interdependent world what all of the likely consequences may end up to be. And therefore, we would say this is one of the chief things that makes decision making in contemporary organizations so difficult for leadership, is that more so and more so in this quickly changing dynamic environment, we operate more and more so under the condition of state of uncertainty, and yet still are forced and we are called to make difficult calls, difficult decisions, where sometimes all the alternatives are bad, all the alternatives have loss associated with it in one way, shape, or another, and we still have to make those decisions in a timely fashion. Now, I would make this last comment for the sake of this short lecture, and that is one of the things that really separates good leadership from poor leadership is the ability, even under conditions of high uncertainty, the ability and the courage to make timely decisions. I think I've mentioned in some lectures previously that one of the very first things I was ever told when I was given my very first management role, my boss pulled me aside and said, You have got to make decisions. Sometimes the decisions you make are simply between the two horrible alternatives, and you're trying to pick the least horrible alternative. But the one thing as a true leader you cannot afford to do is to let your people see you in a state of lack of confidence. You can't appear to be indecisive. You have to make the call, and quite frankly, just simply clean up the damage afterwards if that's what happens. You do the level best with what you've got, the information you've got, the wisdom you've accumulated, the experience you've accrued. You make the call and you live with the consequences. That's what it means to be a leader. That's why we talk about decision making over 3 lectures in this chapter. We'll see you in the next lecture.